cast long shadows across Jerusalem's narrow streets as Simon Peter walked with purpose toward the city. His calloused fisherman's hands swung at his sides, and his mind raced with anticipation. Passover, the feast of liberation, the celebration of freedom from Egypt's bondage. But this year felt different. This year they would celebrate with the Messiah himself. Peter's chest swelled with pride as he thought about it. For 3 years, he'd walked beside the Master. He'd seen the miracles. He'd heard the teachings. He'd even walked on water. Well, briefly, before his faith faltered. But that was the old Peter. The new Peter was ready for anything. "We should get 2 lambs," Peter said to Andrew, who walked beside him through the marketplace. "One might not be enough with all of us." Around them, Jerusalem buzzed with pre-Passover energy. Merchants shouted their prices. The smell of roasting lamb already filled the air as families prepared their feast. Pilgrims from across the Roman world crowded every street, their various accents creating a symphony of anticipation. Peter barely noticed. His thoughts were on tomorrow. Tomorrow, surely, Jesus would reveal his plan. Tomorrow, perhaps, the kingdom would finally come. The Romans would be overthrown. Israel would be free again. Peter's hand instinctively moved to the short sword hidden beneath his cloak. He'd brought it, just in case. "Do you think this is the year?" Andrew asked quietly, reading his brother's thoughts. "The year he establishes the kingdom?" Peter's jaw set with determination. "It has to be. The people are ready. They're waiting for a sign. And whatever happens, brother, I'm ready to die for him if necessary." He meant every word. What Peter didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that in less than 12 hours he wouldn't die for Jesus. He would deny even knowing him. 3 times. Before the rooster crowed, but now in this moment, Peter was invincible, or so he thought. The sun continued its descent toward the horizon. 23 hours and 30 minutes remain, while Peter bargained for supplies in the lower market. John stood in the doorway of a large upper room, his young face contemplative as he surveyed the space. This room would host more than just a meal tonight. John had learned to watch Jesus carefully. Others listened to his words. John watched his eyes, and lately those eyes carried a weight that troubled the young disciple deeply. Something was coming. Something Jesus had been trying to tell them, but that none of them wanted to hear. "Is this acceptable, Rabbi?" John called down the stairs to where Jesus stood in the courtyard below, speaking with the owner of the house. Jesus looked up, and for a moment, their eyes met. In that brief exchange, John felt it again. That unexplainable sadness mixed with fierce love. It was the same look Jesus had given him that morning when John had asked about the future. Jesus had simply said, "Before the rooster crows tomorrow, everything will change." What did that mean? John turned back to the room. It was spacious, freshly swept, with cushions arranged around a low table, perfect for the Passover meal. He could imagine them all here tonight, the 13 of them, celebrating as they had done in previous years. But this year felt different. John's hands trembled slightly as he arranged the cushions. He'd been closer to Jesus than most of the others. He'd been there on the mountain when Jesus' face shone like the sun. He'd heard Jesus pray in private. He'd witnessed moments the others hadn't seen. And in those moments, he'd begun to understand something that terrified him. This Passover wasn't just about remembering Israel's liberation from Egypt. This Passover was about something far greater, something that would require a sacrifice none of them were ready to comprehend. "Lord," John had asked that morning, "when you establish your kingdom, may I sit beside you?" Jesus had smiled sadly. "You don't know what you're asking. Can you drink the cup I'm about to drink?" "Of course," John had answered confidently. Jesus had simply touched his shoulder. "You will drink from my cup, but not in the way you imagine." Now, preparing this room, John couldn't shake the feeling that tonight would be the last normal evening they'd ever share. He was right. But even John, perceptive as he was, couldn't foresee the horror of the next 24 hours. He couldn't imagine seeing his beloved master beaten beyond recognition. He couldn't imagine standing at the foot of a cross, watching the life drain from the man he loved more than his own father. He couldn't imagine that before this time tomorrow, Jesus would entrust his own mother to John's care, because everyone else would have fled. But that knowledge remained mercifully hidden. For now, John simply arranged the room and waited for evening to fall. 23 hours remain. In a shadowed corner of the temple treasury, Judas Iscariot's fingers closed around a leather pouch, 30 pieces of silver. The coins clinked together with a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet room. Caiaphas, the high priest, watched with barely concealed satisfaction as Judas weighed the pouch in his hand. "You're certain of the location?" Caiaphas asked, his voice smooth as oil. Judas nodded slowly. His throat felt tight. "After the meal, he always goes to Gethsemane, the Garden of Olive presses on the Mount of Olives. It's quiet there. Private." "Perfect." Caiaphas leaned forward. "It must be tonight, Judas, before the Sabbath, before he can stir up the crowds any further. You understand the necessity?" Did he understand? Judas had been asking himself that question for days now, ever since the idea first crept into his mind like a serpent. Ever since he'd begun to realize that Jesus wasn't going to be the kind of Messiah Judas had hoped for. There would be no revolution, no overthrow of Rome, no positions of power and wealth for the disciples, just talk of suffering and death and sacrifice. What kind of Messiah chose suffering? "He's dangerous," Judas heard himself saying, though the words felt foreign in his mouth. "His teachings, they could cause Rome to destroy us all. Better one man should die than the whole nation perish. Isn't that what you said?" Caiaphas nodded approvingly. "Exactly. You're doing Israel a service, Judas. History will remember this as an act of patriotism." But even as Judas pocketed the silver, something twisted inside him. He remembered 3 years ago, the day Jesus had called him. "Follow me," Jesus had said, and Judas had left everything. His business, his plans, his carefully constructed life. For what? To end up betraying the very man he'd followed? No, this wasn't betrayal. This was pragmatism. Jesus was leading them all to disaster. Someone had to stop it. Someone had to face reality. And if Judas happened to profit in the process, well, wasn't that just wisdom? The pouch felt heavy against his chest as he left the temple, heavier than 30 pieces of silver should feel. Above him, the sky was beginning to darken. Soon, they would gather for the Passover meal. Jesus would break bread and pour wine. They would sing the traditional psalms. It would all seem so normal. And later tonight, in the darkness of Gethsemane, Judas would lead the guards to Jesus. A kiss, that's all it would take. A simple kiss to identify him. Judas touched his lips with trembling fingers. What he didn't know, what he couldn't foresee, was that in less than 24 hours, he would be hanging from a tree, the silver scattered at his feet, his intestines spilled out in a field bought with blood money. He didn't know that his name would become synonymous with betrayal for all of human history. He didn't know that the guilt would be so crushing that death would seem like mercy. But for now, he simply walked through Jerusalem's streets, the silver heavy in his pocket, and prepared to join his brothers for supper. Satan had already entered his heart. But Judas told himself he was just being reasonable. 22 hours and 30 minutes remain. In a modest home not far from the temple, Mary, the mother of Jesus, stood at a window overlooking the city. Her hands rested on the windowsill, weathered from decades of work, but still strong. She was perhaps 50 years old now, though grief had aged her beyond her years. The city sparkled in the late afternoon light, but Mary barely saw it. She was remembering. 33 years ago, an angel had appeared to her. "You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you are to call him Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High." She'd believed. Of course she'd believed. How could she not, after everything she'd witnessed? But she'd also remembered something else, something that had haunted her for over 3 decades. When Jesus was just 40 days old, they'd taken him to the temple. An old man named Simeon had held her baby in his arms and prophesied, "This child is destined to cause the falling and rising of many in Israel." And then Simeon had looked directly at Mary, and his next words had chilled her soul. "And a sword will pierce your own soul too." A sword. Mary's hand moved unconsciously to her heart. For 33 years, she'd wondered when that sword would fall. She'd worried through his childhood. She'd feared when he began his ministry. She'd watched as the religious leaders grew to hate him, as their murder plots whispered through Jerusalem's streets. And now, standing at this window during Passover, Mary felt it. The sword was coming. Soon. "Mother?" Her niece entered the room. "Will you join us for the Passover?" Mary turned, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. How could she sit at a table and celebrate liberation when she felt such dread? "Is Jesus coming?" Mary asked quietly. "I don't know. They say he's preparing something in an upper room with his disciples." Mary nodded slowly. She'd seen him 2 days ago. He'd embraced her longer than usual, held her as if memorizing the feeling. "I love you, Mother," he'd said. Just that. Nothing more. But it was the way he said it, as if it were the last time. Mothers know. They always know. Mary returned her gaze to the window, to the city where her son taught and healed and loved with an intensity that frightened even those closest to him. Somewhere out there, in an upper room being prepared, her firstborn son would share a final meal with his friends. And though Mary didn't know the details, didn't know about the betrayal, the arrest, the trials, the torture, she knew in her bones that the sword Simeon spoke of was about to pierce her soul. She'd brought the Savior of the world into this world through her own body, and soon she would watch that same body be destroyed. But for now, she simply stood at the window and prayed for strength prayed for understanding, prayed that somehow God's will would be done, even if it broke her heart in the process. The sun touched the horizon. 22 hours remain. In the most ornate chamber of the high priest's house, Caiaphas stood before a bronze mirror, adjusting his elaborate robes. Everything had to be perfect tonight. Behind him, 3 members of the Sanhedrin waited: Annas, his father-in-law and former high priest, and 2 chief priests whose loyalty was absolute. "The arrangements are made?" Annas asked, his voice raspy with age but sharp with intelligence. "Yes." Caiaphas turned from the mirror. "Judas will signal us after their meal. We'll have the temple guards ready, Roman soldiers too, if necessary." The charges? Blasphemy, primarily. Claiming to be the Son of God. That's enough for us to condemn him under Jewish law. But not enough for Rome to execute him, one of the chief priests interjected. "Pilate doesn't care about our religious disputes." Caiaphas smiled coldly. "Then we'll add insurrection. We'll say he claims to be king of the Jews, that he's inciting rebellion against Caesar. Pilate will have no choice but to act." It was brilliant, really. Use Rome's own paranoia against them. Annas nodded approvingly. "And it must happen quickly, before the Sabbath, before he can gather more followers." Caiaphas moved to the window, looking out over the temple complex. From here he could see the court of the Gentiles, where just days ago Jesus had overturned the money changers' tables. The memory still burned. Jesus had made them look like fools. Worse, he'd challenged their authority, their prophet, their entire system. "He's dangerous," Caiaphas said softly. "Not because of what he does, but because of what he represents. Hope, change, a new way. If we let him continue, Rome will come and take away our position and our nation." It was true. Or at least, Caiaphas had convinced himself it was true. Better one man should die than the whole nation be destroyed. What Caiaphas didn't know, what his brilliant political mind couldn't grasp, was that this one man was the very person who would save not just the nation, but the entire world. He didn't know that by killing Jesus, he would actually accomplish God's plan of salvation. He didn't know that the blood he was about to shed would become the blood of the new covenant. He thought he was protecting his power. He didn't realize he was fulfilling prophecy. "Everything is ready," Caiaphas announced to his co-conspirators. "By this time tomorrow, the Nazarene will be dead and order will be restored." The 4 men nodded in satisfaction. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. 21 hours remain. As darkness fell over Jerusalem, 6 different people moved through the city, each toward their own destiny, each unaware of how their paths would intersect in the most consequential event in human history. Peter walked with provisions for the feast, his confidence unshaken, his sword ready. John lit lamps in the upper room, his heart troubled by what he couldn't quite understand. Judas counted his silver one more time, trying to silence the voice in his head that screamed he was making a terrible mistake. Mary knelt in prayer, tears streaming down her face as a mother's intuition tore at her soul. Caiaphas sent word to the captain of the temple guard. "Be ready. Tonight we arrest the Nazarene." And Jesus stood alone on a rooftop, looking over the city he'd wept for just days before. "Jerusalem, Jerusalem," he'd cried then. "How often I have longed to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. Now, As the Passover moon began to rise, Jesus descended from the rooftop and walked toward the upper room where his disciples were gathering. He knew everything that was about to unfold, every betrayal, every denial, every lash of the whip, every thorn in the crown, every nail through flesh. And still, he walked forward. Because this was why he'd come. This was the cup he would drink. This was the love that would save the world. The pieces were all moving into position. The players were taking the stage. The greatest drama in history was about to begin. Peter arrived at the upper room first, laughing with Andrew about something inconsequential. John lit the last lamp, casting warm light across the prepared table. Judas climbed the stairs slowly, the silver heavy in his pocket, and Jesus entered last, looking at each of his disciples with such love that several of them later said they should have known something was desperately wrong. But they didn't know. They couldn't imagine. "I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer," Jesus said softly. "Before I suffer." No one asked what he meant. They would understand soon enough. 20 hours remain, and the Last Supper is about to begin.